Okay, B'ezrat Hashem, today we are picking up Masechet Megillah, the Mishnah, Chet Amud Bet, 8b-9a musgar, the metzora muchlat. We're going to have two sections in today's learning. The first will deal with the differences between two types of metzoraim. We'll see the distinctions. And then the next Mishnah we're going to get to, we'll discuss the difference between the different kitvei HaKodesh, different items that are holy writings. We'll get to that also. B'ezrat Hashem, we'll get to that also today. This is the 7th and 8th of the Ein Bains, actually. Okay, so B'ezrat Hashem, let's get started. Eli, if you don't mind, just shift a little bit that way so that I can see you. So let's just do a brief introduction here. We're going to talk about metzora. There's a lot of halachot when it comes to metzora, but we'll just do short form over here, short story. The halacha is if somebody sees some sort of a spot on his body that might be tzarat. Tzarat is not a physical disease. It presents as a physical disease, but as we know, the Torah teaches us that it's a response for certain averot. The most famous one is Lashon Hara. That's what we know about. But actually, the Gemara says it could be for a series of different averot. Mm-hmm. So it presents as a physical ailment, which some people would translate it as leprosy, but it's not. It's actually a spiritual disease that manifests, that looks like a physical. He goes to a Kohen, and if the Kohen says, this is the Simanei Tumah, now he's Tameh. Now if he's Tameh, that's called metzora muchlat. Muchlat is like defined, he's determined. He's a Tameh metzora, straight. He has to go out of the camp, he has to undergo a process of purification, eventually he comes back in, and then there's the process that he undergoes when it clears up. But there's a middle category which is not muchlat, but it's called metzora musgar. Kohen looks at him and he says, this is not clear. So musgar means he has to go into isolation. He has to be locked up. In the days of COVID, we know this, it's called quarantine. Quarantine, that's what it is. So he goes also out of the camp, he gets locked up for 7 days. The Kohen checks him after 7 days. Now, he looks. The Torah talks about the halachot here. If it minimizes or remains the same, or if it grows. So if it is now simanei tumah, the Kohen will say, okay, you're muchlat, you're tameh, and then he has to undergo the normal process of metzora muchlat. If not, the Kohen says, okay, it's not a siman of tum'ah, so therefore you're allowed to return to the camp, etc. But this Mishnah is going to show us that there is still, during that status of musgar, of being quarantined, there still is chumrot of metzora that are conferred upon this person. He's not just a tahor person. So we're going to see what are the differences in halacha between muchlat and musgar. That's really what we're going to contrast in this first Mishnah of the day. So let's get started. The Mishnah is about 10 lines from the top of the page. Ein ben metzora musgar le metzora muchlat. The only difference between metzora musgar, musgar means confined or quarantined, means he's not the one that's certainly tameh yet, he's quarantined. Le metzora muchlat versus one who is confirmed tameh. Ela priya uprima. Priya is letting their hair grow long. This was something that was done by a muchlat. He had to let his hair grow long. It was actually like similar to a mourner, like an avel in a certain way.
Or Nazir.
Or Nazir. But Nazir is Kedusha. Yeah. Metzora is not because of Kedusha, it's actually because of it's a sign that he did certain averot that made him in this situation. Uprima, and also tearing their clothing, meaning that they would have to tear. Muchlat had to tear his clothing. Also similar to an avel, a similar idea. But a metzora musgar did not have to do that. Okay. Ein bein tahor mitoch hesker le tahor mitoch hechlet. Now, what is the difference between hesker, someone that becomes pure from days of confinement, not from the confirmed metzora status, but rather from the quarantine. So when he undergoes purification after, it's different from the one who has to undergo purification after being a confirmed metzora. The only difference is shaving and birds. So there was a shaving that was done. They would shave off all the hair of the fellow who was muchlat, who was a confirmed metzora. Musgar didn't have to do that. And also tziparim, there were birds brought that were, some of them used for korbanot, that was brought when it was a person who was becoming pure from the muchlat status, not from the musgar status. Now, says the Gemara, so we're saying that these are the differences. Hale inyan shiluach v'tumah implies that regarding being sent out of the camp, we know metzora is like the highest level regarding being sent out of the camps. Different tum'ot could not be within the Machane Yisrael. We know there's the most outer camp is the Machane Yisrael. Inside of that is Leviah, and inside of that was Machane Shechina. The different levels of tumah to be sent out of some of the camps, but the highest level of being sent out was metzora. What Rashi really explains, we see them at Rishonim explain, is because he separated between people with his words. He has b'lashon hara. He has to be sent out of all the camps. So both of them, regarding shiluach, being sent out of the camp, and b'tum'ah, he has a very high level of tum'ah. If he goes into a house and there's kelim, there's item, there's vessels, or there's food in that house, he's like a dead person in a certain sense. It's very interesting. He's like an avel, but a dead. He is mitam'eh. He conveys tum'ah like tumat or like a dead person in a certain way. So such a person, whether he's musgar or muchlat, has both of those halachot of being sent out of the camp and conveying this high level of tumah. In that they're the same. Okay. Zev v'zeh shavin, they're the same. Says the Gemara, Menani Mili. It's the morning. We're holding Chet Amud Bet, 8b. We're about 8b. We're holding it. It's just in the Gemara. We just started the Gemara. About 10, 12 lines, 12, 13 lines from the top of the page. So the Gemara says, Menani Mili. Okay, let's start with the beginning of the Mishnah. How do we know that there is this difference between, again, a metzora musgar, a confined metzora, which means somebody that's quarantined, a quarantined metzora, and muchlat, and the confirmed metzora? How do we know that there is this difference that we said, which is priya or prima? Again, priya is letting the hair grow long, and prima is tearing the clothing. Where do we find in the psukim that there is this difference that's drawn between them? So the Gemara answers, it's Tanya of Shmuel bar Yitzchak Hamed Rav Huna. Shmuel Yitzchak taught in front of Rav Huna the following. The pasuk says, pasuk in Tazria, when the metzora is determined to not be tameh, he goes to the kohen, and it says v'tiaroa kohen, the kohen will purify him. Means the kohen says you're not tameh. Mispachati. Mispachat means it's a skin disease. Means he looks at it and he says, this is not simanei tum'ah, this is a skin disease. This is you have psoriasis, whatever it is. This is not tum'ah. V'chibes begadav v'taher. He washes his clothing v'taher. Now, v'taher is the key word here. V'taher means, you could read it to mean he will be tahor, but that's not the grammar. V'taher really, the way we're learning it now, it means he was tahor. Because as Rashi explains here, if it means moving forward he's tahor, it should have said v'yitaher or v'yitar. But v'taher implies that even before this time that the Kohen said you're tahor moving forward, there was something that he was not restricted from beforehand. So what the Gemara is going to try to say is, this is referring to a metzora musgar, meaning a metzora that wasn't a confirmed metzora yet. V'taher means beforehand he was already tahor from something. Now what is that referring to? It means he doesn't have the same chumrah of a metzora muchlat, a determined metzora, in the sense that he doesn't have to let his hair grow long and tear his clothing. V'taher, he was already exempt of something. What of those two chumrat? That's what we're trying to say. Tahor mi priya o prima de meikara. It means originally he was already pure. He was already exempt from letting his hair grow long and tearing his clothing. So Rav is going to have a problem with this because we find the same terminology v'taher by a zav. And by a zav, there's no such concept. By a zav, again, we spoke about yesterday. There's no such concept that tumah, something was pure beforehand. So he says that can't be the pshat in the word v'taher. So Amar le Rava says to this Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, he says elameata, but based on what you're saying, v'taher means retroactively. I mean, he was always pure. He was always exempt from something. The problem is gabe zav. It says regarding a zav, which is in Parashat Metzora, dichtiv. It says v'chibes begadav. It says he will wash his clothing when he becomes pure. V'taher, and he was pure, the way you're learning it. But the problem is, if that's what it means, hatam mai v'taher meikaraika. By a zav, what original purity did he have? Beforehand he was a regular zav, which means he had all the chumrot of a zav. So obviously v'taher doesn't mean that there was some level of exemption before, because it says that by zav and there's no such concept. So Rava therefore says, it must be by zav. What does it mean? Tahor hashta, very interesting chidush. Tahor hashta milatame klicheres behesit. He is pure now, I'm just going to read it and I'll explain it, from contaminating a earthenware vessel in moving it, Afal gav dahadar chazi, even if he sees again, lo metamel lemafreya. He won't contaminate retroactively. It's a very interesting chidush. With a zav. So he stops his emissions, he waits 7 clean days. Similar to what we do with the nidat today. So zav, similarly you wait shiva nikiyim, 7 clean days, and then at the 7th day, goes to the mikveh while it's still day. Now he needs to wait for the sun to set. Once the sun sets, he's totally considered pure. He also has to bring korbanot the next day if it was 3 times like we learned yesterday, but that's a different story. Fine. What happens if this zav, he goes to the mikveh on the 7th day, before sunset he experiences another emission? Now such a person, it undoes the entire procedure and he's tameh again. It's like there was no purification.
7 days again?
Yeah, exactly. He has to undergo the process again. Now, there's a chumrah of zav in general that even though usually earthenware vessels are only metameh on the inside, which means if you touch it, you put tumah inside of them, they'll be contaminated. With a zav, even if he moves it from the outside, it becomes tameh. It's a chumrah of zav, okay? So now, what happens in a scenario where a zav goes to the mikveh on the 7th day, he moves some earthenware vessels, and before nightfall, he experiences another emission. So retroactively, he's tameh. So you'll say the vessel that he moved should be tameh, because, so that's the chidush. V'taher teaches us that even though he moved the earthenware vessel in between, and his tahara is undone when he experiences another emission, this is a chidush. Rashi explains because it's based on psukim being near each other. The chidush is he's not going to contaminate the vessel retroactively based on his moving it before he experienced that emission before nightfall. That's the chidush. But v'taher is not going back retroactive to his days of tum'ah. It's a chidush that exists between the mikveh and sunset when he experienced another emission. That's what it means by zav. It says the Gemara. So what does it mean here then? Hachinami tahor hashta militami bebia lemafreya. Similar idea. Rava says what it means v'taher here, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have the chumrah of metzora muchlat, but rather what it means is that the metzora musgar, let's say at a similar situation. Metzora, the metzora was told, the kohen told him, you're good to go, you're tahor. He went into a house with vessels and food and other kinds of things, comes out, and then his tzarat spreads. So really now he's tameh. So maybe you'll say, since in between he went into a house, the vessels that are in that house are tameh. Similar idea. Okay, so that's the chidush v'taher. His going into that house will not cause the house to be contaminated based on the fact that it spread after the fact. That's the point. But the point that Rav is making is, it does not teach you metzora musgar is exempt from priya prima, from letting his hair grow long and tearing his clothing. That's not what it's talking about. Right. So Ella Amar Rava. So rather Rava says, what's the source? We still have to find a source. Yeah.
Logically, it's normal that if it's after the fact that he experienced another emission, then why would the keli be contaminated before?
Because that's the halakha actually. Meaning the halakha is, if he experiences, the zav, experiences another emission before sunset, it undoes the entire procedure. Yeah, I mean, he went through 7 clean days trying to become pure.
Okay. So yeah, see. And the chidush is...
Well, think about it in the case of nida.
The keli is tower.
Like think about it in the case of nida. If a woman's keeping shiva nikiyim, and on the 6th day, she experiences bleeding.
Right, again.
The problem is you got a problem, you know what I mean? So, okay, whatever, just it's a similar idea. I mean, so theoretically it should undo the entire process. So now you have that issue. Okay, fine, that's okay, we understand. Elama Rava. So rather, says Rava, what's the source again that the confined metzora, not the confirmed metzora, the musgar, how do we know that he does not have the laws of letting his hair grow long and tearing his clothing? So it's based on another pasuk, and the pasuk says as follows. It says, in the context of priya, this is in the context of those mitzvot of the metzora, of letting his hair grow long and tearing his clothing. It says, V'atzarua asher bo hanega, the tzarua, this tamei metzora, asher bo hanega, that the tzarat is on him. Asher bo, that the tzarat is on him. He has the mitzvah of priya prima, of letting his hair grow long and tearing his clothing. So what does Rava say? Asher bo, what's the emphasis that it's on him? Mi shetzarato tluya begufo. It means the type of metzora that the tzarat is dependent on his body. Means he has a siman on his body of tum'ah. on him. But this excludes the musgar, the quarantine metzora, she'ein tzarato tluya begufo. It's not dependent on his body. Means we don't know that it's necessarily a siman tuma on his body. Ela biyamim. It's dependent on days. Again, after 7 days, the Kohen comes to check him again, and maybe it's not an issue at all. So the point is, asher bo, says Rava, that implies metzora muchlat. The determined metzora has these, which is what the context of that verse is talking about, these halachot of priya u'prima, not the musgar. Abaye says to Rav, but according to what you're saying, we know that it says regarding the mitzvah of being sent out of the camp. And regarding Tumah, what does it say? Kol yemei asher anega bo yitma. It says all the days that the tzarat is on him. Now the way you're understanding that, Rava, it refers to the muchlat, the determined mitzvah. Sherbo means on his body, that it means the determined itma. He shall be tameh. So would you then say, Mishet tzarato tliya begufo hudeta on shiluach? It's time of being sent out of the camp. Is it only the one that is a determined mitzvah that's sent out of the camp? V'she'ein tzarato tliya begufo. And if it's a musgar, ein taon shiluach, he does not need to be sent out of the camp. Maybe he'll say that's true. The problem is our Mishnah said clearly that's not true. Because what did it say? Or the implication, I should say. Our Mishnah said, Our Mishnah said the difference between these two types of metzora is letting the hair grow long and tearing the clothing. But we were medayik from that. We implied from that. Regarding being sent out of the camp and conveying tum'ah, shavin. They're the same. So you can't tell me asher bo means a metzora muchlat to the exclusion of musgar, because we find that same language by being sent out of the camp, and they're both sent out of the camp. Amar lei, so Rav responds to Abaye, Yemei, kol yemei, l'rabot metzora musgar l'shiluach. You're right. Really, asher bo would only imply the determined metzora. But it says that word by being sent out of the camp. In that pasuk, there's an extra word kol. Kol is a riboy, it's an inclusionary term. So it teaches us, even though without the word kol, you'd exclude from the pasuk the metzora musgar. Now that it says the word kol, it means it's included also, and therefore he's also sent out of the camp. So we found the source, Baruch Hashem. Now, the Mefarshim take out, the Bach takes these next words out. Ihachi. Skip to the next line. Ein bein tahor, because really this is a separate point. The second part of our Mishnah said, Ein bein tahor mitoch hesker letar mitoch hechlet el taglachat v'tziparim. So we said when they become pure, the difference between these two mitzoraim becoming pure is that if it's a muchlat, a determined mitzora, he needs to bring 2 birds and he also has to shave off his hair. But if it's a musgar, he doesn't have to do those things. So the Gemara says, the Bach adds in over here, I believe he adds in my time, of what's the reason? So Abaye says, Amar Kra, it's based on a pasuk in metzora. It says when the person is becoming pure, V'yatza kohen al michutz lamachane, the kohen has to go outside of the camp. He has to go outside of the camp because the metzora until now was outside. That's shiluach. He was sent out of the camp. And what does it say there? They would bring the birds and the kohen would shave off his hair, etc. V'hinei nirpa nega tzarat, and it says in the pasuk, behold, the sign of tzarat has healed. Now the key word is it's been healed. So what do you see? Misha tzaratot tluya b'refuot. That the one who needs to do this procedure of the birds and the shaving is the one who requires healing. Meaning he was a metzora for certain, and it needs to heal to remove that tum'ah. Yatzazeh, which excludes this one, which is a musgar, she'ein tzaratot tluya b'refuot. It's not contingent on healing, because we don't know for sure that he's tameh. Ela biyamim, it's just dependent on days, meaning if the kohen would come after 7 days and see that it doesn't look like tum'ah, it's the same size or it's diminished, so he says, okay, you're not tameh, no problem. So therefore the pasuk, by saying refuah, it's only the muchlat that has to do these procedures at the end, not the musgar. Let's move on now to the next aiming. We'll just start the sugya, we'll pick up with it tomorrow. It's a very interesting sugya, and this actually gets into scripts. Very interesting idea. When it comes to Sefer Torah, so generally we write Sefrei Torah in Lashon HaKodesh. It's written in what we know as Hebrew. Actually, it's called Lashon Ashurit, Ktav Ashurit. That's actually what it's called in the Mishnah. What is Ashurit? Ashurit are the square Hebrew lettering as we know it, as we write in the Sefer Torah today. We're going to see, I'll tell you when we start the Gemara, there's another script that used to be used, that's not used anymore today, and I'll show it to you. It looks like hieroglyphics. Very interesting. It's not the old coins from like Judea might have these on it. It's like a, But the Mishnah here tells us when you're writing Kitvei HaKodesh, there's a special language, or special languages perhaps they have to be written in, versus, as we'll see, some things could be written in all languages. Ein bein sefarim, the only difference between sefarim. Now Rashi learned sefarim here means Sifrei Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. But again, this doesn't refer to the books that we have really. Really what we're talking about, back in the day, they had all these things in scrolls, like scroll format. Or we have today, you pull out the Tanakh from the shelf, that's a book. But they used to have all of it in scrolls, handwritten, that was, some people still, like we have here, on Shabbat, when they use for Haftarah, I believe they use, that's also handwritten in a scroll. So they used to have, that was all of them were like that. So, ein bein sefarim tefillin mezuzot. The only difference between the scrolls of Tanakh versus tefillin and mezuzot. Now, tefillin and mezuzot, you have certain parshiot in there too. Tefillin and mezuzot, you have Shema, you have certain parshiot in there too. Ella, the only difference is shasfarim nichtavin bechol lashon. So the Mishnah says Tanakh could be written in any language. Meaning, if you want to write a Sefer Torah in Spanish, it's okay. Very interesting. The Mishnah is saying. But tefillin and mezuzot are only allowed to be written in Ashurit, which is the Hebrew block letters that we know. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, af b'sfarim lo itiru sheyichtavu ele Yevanit. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees. He says, even regarding Sfarim, the only other language you could write than Hebrew is Yevanit. Yevanit is Greek, and we'll see in the Gemara. He's arguing, meaning you're saying that Sfarim can be written in any language. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel argues, he says, no, the only other language other than Hebrew that Sfarim could be written in is Greek. We'll have to see why. We'll see that in the Gemara, God willing, tomorrow. Says the Gemara, the fact that we're contrasting these and making the only distinction as we said, so that implies, haletofran begidin, regarding stitching them with sinews. These books are stitched, or these scrolls are stitched with the sinews of a cow, actually a kosher animal. They were stitched like that. And also regarding contaminating the hands, we learned scrolls, Kitvei HaKodesh, you touch them, we learned about this before, they make your hands tameh, takana, zeh v'zeh shavin, they are the same. So meaning the fact that we make the distinction in the Mishnah and don't list this, it means in regards to this, they're the same. They both need to be stitched with the sinews of the animal, and also they both need to be, and they both would contaminate your hands if you touch them. Okay, let's get into this now. So we said in the Mishnah, Sfarim could be written in any language. We have a contradiction, because the Braita says as follows. Mikra shekatvu targum. If you have a pasuk that is written in Targum, now Targum is Aramaic, because that's like Targum Unkulus, it's written in Aramaic.
Right.
So in the Torah, instead of writing the pasuk in Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh,
Right.
you wrote it in Aramaic, okay? Or the Targum shekatvu mikra, if it's a pasuk that's in Aramaic, there are certain words in the Torah, we'll see examples of it tomorrow, that are actually written in Aramaic. But instead of writing it in Aramaic, he wrote it in Hebrew.
Hebrew
Letters, exactly. Well, let's say Hebrew language. Let's just say like that for now. The Ktav Ivri, or if he wrote it in Ktav Ivri. Now, Ivri is very interesting. Ivri sounds a lot like Hebrew. Ivri is Ivrit today. But that actually was a different script that they used back in the day. And it was, I'm going to show it to you after, but it doesn't look like the Hebrew block letters as we know it. I'll show it to you when we finish. But it was a different script. It's the same language, but it's a different script. Okay? So the Braita says it doesn't contaminate the hands, meaning that's not considered legal Kitvei HaKodesh. Unless it's written in Ktav Ashurit, which is Lashon HaKodesh as we know it. Ala Sefer, also it has to be on scroll, meaning it has to be on klaf, which is processed hides. Uvidiyo, with black ink. So what do you see from this? You see, in order for it to be a proper Kitvei HaKodesh, it has to be written in Ashurit, which is Lashon HaKodesh. But we said in our Mishnah, B'chol Lashon, it's contradiction. So let's do the first answer. We're going to refute this tomorrow, but Amar Rava. Rava has a fascinating answer. Lo kashya. This is not a question. Turning to Tet Amud Aleph. Kan begufan shelanu. This, when we said in our Mishnah it could be written in any language, this is when it's written with our script, with our lettering. What does it mean? It means you could write a Sefer Torah in Spanish, transliterated into Hebrew lettering. Let me just say in English and give the example. If you wanted to write a Sefer Torah in English, transliterated with Hebrew lettering, that would be acceptable. You can use a foreign language as long as you use the Hebrew letters. So what does that mean? Let me just explain what that means. What it means is, if I wanted to write, instead of Bereshit bara Elokim, I wanted to write in the beginning, and I wrote Aleph, Chirik, Yud, Nun, in, Dalid Aleph, the beginning, Bet, Yud, Gimel. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So Rav is saying that's what the Mishnah is saying is acceptable.
Wow.
Because you're using Hebrew lettering, even though you're transliterating from a foreign language. And Khan, the Braita that says it has to be an Ashurit, Begufan Shalahen. The problem is you were using the foreign lettering. So then you wrote actually I-N in the beginning. That would be problematic. So in our Mishnah, this is Rava's answer. Abai is going to refute this tomorrow, we'll see. But Rava is saying, when our Mishnah says you could use B'chol Lashon, it means where you transliterated from a foreign language using Hebrew lettering. And when the Braita says you only could write in Ashurit, it means where instead of using the Hebrew lettering, you use English lettering or Chinese lettering, or whatever it is, some foreign, and that wouldn't be acceptable. Okay, we're going to have to stop here. Abai is going to refute Rava, but we'll pick up with Tetamud Aleph tomorrow. Give a few more answers, God will.
Exactly.
Wonderful.